In the public eye, Freddie Mercury was larger than life, loud, fearless, outrageous, untouchable. The kind of man who walked onto a stage and made an entire stadium feel like it belonged to him. But behind the glamour, behind the leather and the lights and the laughter, there were things Freddie did that he never wanted credit for. Things so private, so quietly human, that even the people closest to him didn't fully understand why he insisted on keeping them hidden. This story begins on a cold London afternoon in the late 1980s, when Freddie slipped out of Garden Lodge without security, without cameras, without the usual entourage. No press. No fans outside the gate. Just Freddie, wearing a dark coat and sunglasses, trying to disappear into the city like an ordinary man. He wasn't going to a club. He wasn't going to a studio. He wasn't going to see the band. He was going to see a stranger. A young man whose name would never appear in a headline. A person the world would never applaud. Someone who had written Freddie a letter, not asking for money, not asking for fame, not asking for anything selfish, but confessing a quiet kind of desperation that Freddie couldn't ignore. And when Freddie finally met him, face to face, it wasn't a heroic moment like the movies would make it. It was awkward. Uncomfortable. Painfully real. Because Freddie recognized something in that young man that terrified him. Not the illness. Not the poverty. Not the sadness. The loneliness. What happened next became one of Freddie Mercury's most secret acts of kindness, a private gift that changed someone's entire life, and revealed a side of Freddie the world never saw. But Freddie attached one condition. One rule. He looked the man in the eye and said, "You will never tell anyone I did this. Not while I'm alive." Why would a man who lived for applause demand silence? What was Freddie hiding, not from the world, but from himself? And what happened years later, when the secret finally slipped out? Stay with this story, because the truth behind Freddie Mercury's quiet generosity is more heartbreaking, and more personal, than anyone ever imagined. The envelope was plain. No glitter. No perfume. No dramatic handwriting meant to catch attention. It looked like something that could have been a bill, the kind of boring letter that usually ended up unopened on the corner of Freddie's kitchen counter at Garden Lodge. But somehow, it made it through. It was the kind of thing that should have been filtered out by assistants, by managers, by security, by the sheer volume of mail that arrived every week from strangers who believed Freddie owed them something. Yet this one landed where it shouldn't have, on the polished wooden table near the living room window, placed there by someone who didn't even realize what they were delivering. Freddie noticed it late at night. He had come home from a long day of rehearsals, throat tired, body aching, mind buzzing with the constant noise of being watched. Garden Lodge was beautiful, elegant walls, warm lamps, expensive quiet, but some nights it felt less like a home and more like a museum built around a man who didn't know where to put his loneliness. Jim had already gone to bed. The house was silent except for the soft tick of a clock somewhere down the hall. Freddie poured himself a drink he didn't need and stared at the pile of letters on the table. Most of them made him tired just looking at them. "Please come to my wedding. Please help my band. Please send me money. Please tell me you love me." Fame had turned love into a demand. Freddie usually ignored them. Not because he didn't care, but because caring about everyone would destroy him. Then he saw the plain envelope. No flashy stamp. No dramatic message on the front. Just his name typed neatly, almost shyly. He picked it up. Something about the simplicity irritated him, and intrigued him. He tore it open with a sigh, expecting disappointment. Instead, he froze after the first paragraph. The letter wasn't worshipful. It wasn't begging. It wasn't trying to be clever. It was honest. It was written by a young man in London, someone anonymous, someone invisible to the world, who explained that he had never written to a celebrity before. That he didn't even know if Freddie would read it. That he almost threw it away because it felt ridiculous to send his pain to someone who lived in mansions and stood under spotlights. But he sent it anyway. Because he had nowhere else to put it. He described being sick, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, humiliating way. The kind of illness that makes people stop touching you. Stop inviting you out. Stop calling. The kind that turns your world into a small room and long hours of silence. He wrote about losing his job. About friends disappearing. About family pretending nothing was happening because admitting it would mean facing it. And then he wrote a sentence that made Freddie's stomach tighten. I don't think I'm afraid of dying as much as I'm afraid of being forgotten before I'm gone. Freddie stared at that line for a long time. His drink sat untouched. Outside the window, the city lights flickered like distant stars. Freddie felt something rise in his throat, not tears, not yet, but something sharp and bitter. Because that sentence didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to him. Freddie Mercury, adored by millions, surrounded by people, celebrated everywhere he went, had spent more nights than he would ever admit feeling exactly that. Afraid not of death, but of disappearing. He read the rest of the letter slowly, like it was a confession meant only for him. The young man never asked for money. Never asked for an autograph. Never asked to meet him. He only asked one thing. If you ever feel alone too, please know you made someone like me feel less invisible. Freddie's hands trembled slightly as he lowered the paper. For a moment, he wanted to throw it away, not out of cruelty, but out of self-defense. Because if he let that letter inside him, it would open a door he worked hard to keep locked. But he didn't throw it away. He folded it carefully. And when Jim quietly appeared in the doorway, half asleep, rubbing his eyes, Freddie didn't hide the paper like he usually hid anything vulnerable. Jim looked at him and immediately sensed something was wrong. What is it? Jim asked softly. Freddie stared at the letter, jaw tight. It's nothing, he almost said. But the lie didn't come. Instead, Freddie whispered. I think. I need to see him. Jim blinked. Who? Freddie lifted the letter slightly. The boy who wrote this. Jim hesitated. Freddie, that's dangerous. People lie. I know, Freddie said, voice low. But this doesn't feel like a lie. Jim stepped closer, reading a line over Freddie's shoulder. His expression shifted as he realized the letter wasn't fan worship, it was pain. Freddie swallowed hard. I can't explain it, he murmured. But if I ignore this, I'll hate myself. And in that quiet room, under warm lamplight, Freddie made a decision that would stay secret for years. He would help the young man. Not as Freddie Mercury. As Freddie. Freddie chose the place carefully. Not a cafe near Garden Lodge. Not somewhere fashionable where people might recognize him even behind dark glasses. He picked a small, almost forgettable tea room tucked between a laundromat and a closed bookstore in West London, the kind of place people passed every day without ever really noticing. It felt appropriate. He arrived early, wearing a long dark coat, scarf pulled high around his neck, sunglasses still on despite the gray afternoon. He sat at a corner table, back against the wall, hands folded tightly in front of him. For the first time in years, he felt nervous in a way fame couldn't prepare him for. This wasn't a fan meeting. There would be no admiration, no applause, no distance. This was two people meeting without roles. The door opened. A young man stepped inside hesitantly, pausing just inside the entrance like he wasn't sure he was in the right place. He looked thinner than Freddie expected. His shoulders were slightly hunched, as if he was used to making himself smaller. He scanned the room. Freddie lifted a hand. The young man froze. Recognition flickered across his face, not excitement, not disbelief, but something closer to panic. He walked over slowly, carefully, like approaching an animal that might disappear if startled. You actually came, the man said quietly. Freddie removed his sunglasses. Yes, he replied simply. They sat in silence for a moment. The waitress came and went, oblivious to the wait sitting at that table. Freddie ordered tea. The young man followed suit, hands shaking slightly as he spoke. "I didn't think you would," the man admitted. "I almost didn't show up." Freddie studied him, the pale skin, the tired eyes, the effort it took for him to sit upright without leaning heavily on the chair. "I almost didn't come either," Freddie said. That surprised him. The man let out a nervous laugh. "I suppose that makes us even." Freddie smiled faintly. They talked at first about nothing. The weather. The tea. The awkwardness of the room. Anything except the letter sitting folded in Freddie's coat pocket, heavy as a confession. Finally, Freddie spoke. "I read your letter," he said quietly. The man's shoulders tensed. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "No," Freddie interrupted gently. "I'm glad you did." The man looked down, embarrassed. "I didn't write it for money. Or attention. I needed to say it somewhere." "I know," Freddie said. He reached into his coat and placed the folded letter on the table between them. "I've received thousands of letters," Freddie continued. "Most of them tell me who I am to other people. Yours told me who you are." The man swallowed hard. "I didn't think anyone would understand it," he admitted. "Not someone like you." Freddie's jaw tightened slightly. "Someone like me," he repeated. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I need you to understand something," Freddie said. "What you wrote, about being invisible, about being afraid of being forgotten, that wasn't unfamiliar to me." The man looked up sharply. Freddie met his eyes fully now, no performance left. "Fame doesn't cure loneliness," Freddie said softly. "It just gives it better lighting." The man's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was ridiculous for writing to you," he whispered. Freddie shook his head. "You were brave." The man wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed. "I didn't expect you to do anything. I just wanted you to know your music, it kept me company." Freddie nodded slowly. "That's why I'm here," he said. The man frowned. "I don't understand." Freddie hesitated. This was the part he hadn't rehearsed. "I want to help you," Freddie said finally. "Not as a charity case. Not as a headline. As a person." The man stiffened. "I don't want pity." "You're not getting it," Freddie replied immediately. "I don't give pity. I give choices." Silence fell between them again. The man looked away, ashamed. "I don't know how to accept help." Freddie smiled sadly. "Neither do I." He reached into his coat again, pulling out a small envelope, not thick, not flashy. He placed it on the table gently, as if it were fragile. "This is not payment," Freddie said firmly. "And it's not a gift." The man stared at it without touching it. "Then what is it?" Freddie inhaled slowly. "It's time," he said. "Security. Options. Something to breathe with." The man's hands trembled as he finally touched the envelope. "I can't tell anyone about this," Freddie added suddenly. The man looked up, confused. "I mean it," Freddie said, his voice hard now. "No interviews. No stories. No gratitude speeches. If you ever tell someone I did this while I'm alive, I'll regret it." "Why?" the man asked. Freddie looked down at his tea, steam rising gently between them. "Because I don't want to be a savior," he said. "And I don't want applause for kindness." He met the man's eyes again. "I just want to know I helped someone without turning it into a performance." The man nodded slowly, tears spilling freely now. "I swear," he said. "I won't tell anyone." Freddie exhaled shakily, relief and fear tangled together. "Good," he whispered. They sat there quietly after that, two strangers bound by something fragile and unspoken. When they finally stood to leave, Freddie placed a hand briefly on the man's shoulder, light, steady. "Take care of yourself," Freddie said. "I will," the man replied. "Because you believed I mattered." Freddie nodded once and turned away. As he stepped back into the street, pulling his scarf higher against the cold, he felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Not joy. Not pride. Something quieter. Something honest. And he knew, with unsettling clarity, that this was a secret he would carry alone, exactly the way he wanted it. Freddie didn't speak about the meeting to anyone. Not to the band. Not to friends. Not even to Jim. He returned to Garden Lodge that evening quieter than usual, slipping off his coat and placing it carefully over the chair as if noise itself felt intrusive. The house welcomed him with warm lights and familiar silence, but something inside him had shifted, subtle, unsettled, like a note left unresolved. Jim noticed immediately. "You okay?" he asked casually from the kitchen. Freddie hesitated, then nodded. "Just tired." It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. That night, Freddie couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the young man's face, the mixture of disbelief and relief, the way his hands shook when he touched the envelope, the quiet dignity with which he promised silence. "I swear." The words echoed in Freddie's mind. Freddie had demanded that promise because he needed something pure, a moment untouched by fame, untouched by narrative. But as the hours passed, he realized something unsettling. The promise wasn't just for the young man. It was for himself. In the days that followed, Freddie found himself thinking about the letter constantly. Not obsessively, not anxiously, but persistently. It followed him into rehearsals, into studio sessions, into moments when laughter should have come easily but didn't. He began to watch people differently. During soundchecks, he noticed the quiet ones first, the stagehand who always stood slightly apart, the assistant who spoke only when spoken to. At parties, he drifted away from the loud center of attention, gravitating toward corners where people spoke softly, cautiously. Loneliness had started to reveal itself everywhere. And it terrified him. Because it mirrored something he worked desperately to outrun. One afternoon, weeks later, Freddie received a short note slipped into his mail. No return address. No name. Just a few words. "I used the time you gave me. Thank you." Freddie stared at the paper for a long time. His throat tightened. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into a drawer he rarely opened, the one where he kept things that mattered but didn't belong to the world. That drawer grew heavier over time. At rehearsals, Brian noticed Freddie pulling back, not musically, but emotionally. "You've been quiet," Brian said one day, tuning his guitar. "Everything all right?" Freddie smiled easily. "Perfectly." Roger wasn't convinced. "You sure you're not disappearing on us again?" Freddie laughed it off. "If I disappear, darling, you'll hear about it." But later, alone in the dressing room, Freddie stared at his reflection and wondered when he had become so skilled at vanishing in plain sight. The kindness he'd shown that stranger hadn't made him lighter. It had made him more aware. Aware of how fragile connection really was. Aware of how easily people slipped through the cracks. Aware of how close he himself lived to that edge. Some nights, Freddie would sit alone in the living room long after everyone had gone to bed, lights dimmed, music playing softly. He would think about the boy, not with pity, but with a strange sense of kinship. Two men navigating fear in different disguises. One invisible. One impossibly visible. Freddie began sending quiet instructions through trusted intermediaries, anonymous payments, quiet arrangements for medical care, housing stability. Always indirect. Always untraceable. And always with the same rule. No one talks about this. He told himself it was humility. But deeper down, it was fear. Because if the world knew how deeply he cared, how much he saw himself in the forgotten, it would mean admitting that the persona he performed every night was a shield. And shields crack. One evening, Jim finally pressed him. "You've been carrying something," Jim said gently. "I don't need to know what. But I need to know if you're okay." Freddie looked at him for a long moment. "I helped someone," Freddie said finally. Jim waited. "It wasn't grand," Freddie added. "No big moment. Just, necessary." Jim smiled softly. "That sounds like you." Freddie shook his head. "No. It sounds like who I wish I was more often." Jim reached for his hand. "You don't owe the world your suffering." Freddie squeezed his fingers back, but said nothing. Because the truth was harder. The more Freddie gave quietly, the more he realized how rarely he allowed himself the same compassion. The promise of silence had become a kind of burden, a secret weight that pressed against his chest whenever the house grew quiet. And yet, he wouldn't take it back. Because for one brief moment, in a small tea room with no cameras and no applause, Freddie Mercury had done something purely human. And that frightened him more than any crowd ever could. Silence has weight. Freddie Mercury learned that slowly. At first, the secrecy felt protective, a barrier between something pure and a world that had a way of turning everything into spectacle. But as weeks passed, then months, the silence began to change shape. It no longer felt like privacy. It felt like isolation. Freddie sat in his living room at Garden Lodge one evening, lights dimmed, the faint hum of London traffic drifting in through the windows. The piano across the room stood untouched, its glossy surface reflecting the lamps like a mirror he wasn't ready to face. He should have been writing. Deadlines loomed. The band was restless. Ideas waited to be shaped into songs. Instead, Freddie sat still, staring at nothing. He had helped someone survive, and yet, he felt strangely hollow. Because no one knew. Not the fans who screamed his name. Not the press who speculated endlessly. Not even the people who loved him. And the silence pressed against him harder than the noise ever had. At rehearsals, Freddie laughed louder than usual, sharper, quicker, a kind of armor disguised as charm. Brian noticed the way his jokes came faster, how rarely they reached his eyes. "You're on fire lately," Roger joked one afternoon. Freddie grinned. "Always, darling." But when the laughter faded, the emptiness returned immediately. Some nights, Freddie would replay the meeting in his head, the tea growing cold on the table, the young man's hands trembling as he accepted help, the quiet dignity in his promise to stay silent. Freddie had wanted that moment to stay small. Instead, it grew. He found himself wondering constantly if the man was okay. If the help had been enough. If loneliness had loosened its grip even slightly. But he couldn't ask. That was the cost of secrecy. One evening, as Freddie sat at the piano, fingers hovering over the keys, Jim entered the room quietly. "You're drifting," Jim said gently. Freddie didn't look up. "Am I?" Jim leaned against the doorway. "You are. And you don't usually drift unless something's eating at you." Freddie pressed a single key, a soft, unresolved note that echoed briefly before dying away. "I did something good," Freddie said quietly. Jim waited. "And it made me feel worse," Freddie added. Jim frowned. "That doesn't make sense." Freddie let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a laugh. "Most things in my life don't." He finally turned to look at Jim. "I helped someone who was disappearing," Freddie said. "And in doing so, I realized how invisible I feel when no one is looking." Jim crossed the room and sat beside him on the piano bench. "You're not invisible to me," Jim said. Freddie nodded. "I know. But I'm invisible to myself." The admission hung between them. Freddie stared at his hands. "When people applaud me, it fills the room. When it stops, I hear everything I've been avoiding." Jim rested his head lightly against Freddie's shoulder. You don't have to carry everything alone. Freddie closed his eyes. But he already was. The kindness he had given, pure, quiet, unacknowledged, had stripped something away. It had shown him a version of himself that didn't need lights or validation. And that terrified him. Because if that version of Freddie was real, then who was the man on stage? Days later, a second note arrived. Even shorter than the first. I'm still here. Freddie read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer. Still here. The words should have comforted him. Instead, they made his chest ache. Because Freddie wasn't sure he could say the same about himself. At a party weeks later, surrounded by people, music blaring, champagne flowing, Freddie slipped out onto the terrace alone. The city spread out below him, glittering and distant. He leaned against the railing, breathing in the cool air. For the first time, the applause felt far away. He thought about the secret he carried, the life he had touched quietly, without witnesses. And he realized something painful. He didn't regret helping. He regretted that the moment had shown him how desperately he wanted to be known without being watched. The secret hadn't made him noble. It had made him honest. And honesty, Freddie was learning, was lonelier than fame. He straightened, squared his shoulders, and went back inside, laughter already forming on his lips. Because if the world demanded a performance, he would give it one. Even as the silence followed him like a shadow he could no longer outrun. Freddie never expected anything to come back to him. That had been the rule from the beginning, not just for the young man, but for himself. No gratitude. No recognition. No sense of balance restored. He had given because something inside him had demanded it, not because he believed kindness would heal him in return. But kindness has a strange way of circling back. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Freddie noticed it first in the smallest moments. A change in how he listened. During rehearsals, when Brian talked through an arrangement for the 10th time, Freddie didn't interrupt with jokes. He listened, really listened, as if sound itself had become more fragile to him. When Roger complained about exhaustion, Freddie didn't deflect it with sarcasm. He nodded, understanding something deeper beneath the words. He was beginning to recognize pain even when it wore a mask. One evening, after a long studio session, Freddie lingered alone in the control room. The others had already left, laughter echoing faintly down the corridor. Freddie sat in the dim light, staring at the mixing board as if it might reveal something about himself. He thought about the man again. Not his illness. Not the money. But the way he had looked at Freddie when he realized he was being taken seriously. As if being seen, quietly, honestly, had been more powerful than the help itself. Freddie exhaled slowly. He realized he had spent years performing generosity in public, benefits, donations, gestures that were expected of someone in his position. They had always felt correct, appropriate. But this had been different. This had required him to sit with another human being without protection. And that vulnerability had unsettled him more than any stage fright. Late one night, Freddie found himself at the piano again. Not writing for Queen. Not chasing a hit. Just touching the keys. The melody that came out was soft, unresolved, almost hesitant, nothing like the anthems he was famous for. He played it again, slightly differently, as if searching for something. Jim watched from the doorway. "That's new," Jim said. Freddie didn't look up. "It doesn't know where it's going yet." Jim smiled faintly. "Neither do you." Freddie paused, fingers hovering over the keys. "You ever do something good and feel worse afterward?" Freddie asked quietly. Jim stepped closer. "Yes." Freddie finally looked at him. "Why?" Jim considered it. "Because sometimes doing good strips away the excuses we hide behind." Freddie nodded slowly. The secret kindness had removed something he'd relied on, the idea that the world's cruelty justified his armor. Helping someone without witnesses had left him exposed, without applause to cushion the impact. And now he felt naked. Weeks later, a third note arrived. This one wasn't a thank you. It was a description. The man wrote about walking through a park again. About sitting on a bench and watching people pass without feeling like a ghost. About making plans, small ones, for the first time in months. At the bottom, one line stood alone. I don't feel invisible anymore. Freddie read it standing by the window, afternoon light spilling across the paper. His throat tightened. He folded the note carefully and pressed it briefly against his chest, a gesture so small it felt embarrassing. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel something close to peace. Not pride. Not relief. Connection. But the feeling didn't last. Because connection always carried risk. That night, lying awake in bed, Freddie stared into the darkness and confronted a thought he had been avoiding. If helping someone feel seen mattered this much, why had he never allowed himself the same grace? Why was his own suffering something to be hidden, laughed off, drowned in excess? The kindness he had offered in secret was now turning inward, asking uncomfortable questions. And Freddie wasn't sure he liked the answers. At rehearsal the next day, Brian pulled him aside. You've changed, Brian said gently. Freddie raised an eyebrow. For better or worse? Brian smiled sadly. I don't know yet. But you seem more present. Freddie considered that. Presence. It sounded simple. It felt terrifying. Because being present meant not running. And Freddie had built an entire life on motion. That night, alone again, Freddie opened the drawer where he kept the notes. He laid them out carefully on the table, not like trophies, but like evidence. Proof that silence could still hold meaning. Proof that kindness didn't need an audience. Proof that he was capable of something gentle. He gathered the papers and placed them back inside the drawer. Then he closed it. Not because he wanted to forget. But because he knew the final weight of this secret was still coming. And when it did, it would ask more of him than he was ready to give. Freddie Mercury never told the story himself. That was the point. When he died, the world exploded with noise, tributes, documentaries, headlines, candlelight vigils, voices trying desperately to explain who he had been. Everyone wanted to define him. To claim a piece. To translate his life into something consumable. But some truths don't rise with noise. They surface quietly. Years later. In a room with no cameras. The young man, no longer quite so young, stood in a small support group meeting in London. He wasn't there to talk about Freddie Mercury. He hadn't planned to say anything at all. He had come to listen, like he often did. But someone mentioned loneliness. And something inside him shifted. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but soft. He didn't use names at first. He talked about being sick. About disappearing socially. About the moment when he believed his life had already ended, even though his heart was still beating. Then he paused. There was someone, he said quietly. Someone who helped me when no one else saw me. People leaned in. He swallowed. He asked me to promise never to tell while he was alive. The room was silent. I kept that promise. Someone asked gently, who was he? The man hesitated. Then he said the name. Freddie Mercury. The silence shattered. Disbelief. Shock. Questions spilling over one another. But the man didn't dramatize it. He didn't glorify it. He didn't even smile. He didn't want credit, the man continued. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted me to feel real. Word spread slowly after that. Not as a headline. Not as a scandal. As a whisper. People who had known Freddie in different ways began to recognize the pattern, the quiet generosity, the anonymous help, the insistence on silence. Stories surfaced not from tabloids, but from hospital workers, from friends of friends, from people who had once received something life-changing with no signature attached. The public image of Freddie Mercury didn't change. But it deepened. For Jim, the truth landed with a strange mixture of grief and understanding. Sitting alone in Garden Lodge years later, surrounded by memories, he finally understood why Freddie had insisted on secrecy. Freddie hadn't wanted to be remembered as kind. He had wanted kindness to exist without him. The band learned about the story quietly. Brian sat with it for a long time before speaking. "That sounds like him," he said softly. Roger shook his head, eyes wet. "He always did the most important things when no one was watching." John said nothing. He simply nodded. Mary cried. Not because she was surprised. But because she wasn't. Freddie Mercury had spent his life commanding attention, but his truest self had lived in moments without witnesses. In gestures that didn't echo. In lives changed quietly, permanently. The young man kept living. That was Freddie's real gift. Not the money. Not the access. Not the miracle. The permission to believe he mattered. Sometimes, late at night, Freddie's music still played in that man's apartment. Not loudly. Not reverently. Just, present. And in those moments, the man would think of Freddie not as a star, not as an icon, not as a legend frozen in time. But as a human being who once sat across from him in a forgotten tea room, looked him in the eye, and chose to care, without asking the world to notice. Freddie never broke his rule. He never told the story. But in the end, the silence did what noise never could. It told the truth.